Hi, I'm Mark Hoth and welcome to Swift Almanac. In our last lesson, we completed the display of our data within the app, and now we need to set up a subscription service. I was going to use the Stripe API, but that's got some issues currently with iOS 11. And then I looked at the App Store payments, and Apple takes 30%, which is a bit outrageous. I'm collecting this money to predominantly pay for GitHub and Atlassian memberships. So I'm just sort of collecting it and paying it out straight away. So I have opted to use Patreon, which allows people to both set up subscriptions and make payments during live streams. Patreon only keeps 5%, and they provide some nice functionality for live streaming, which we're going to use in 2018. So in this lesson, we're going to look at activity indicators and the network activity indicator. Also, we're going to create a special YouTube class so that our hyperlinks actually open in YouTube if it's installed. Let's have a look. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is network activity indicators. And you can see, oops, well you could see, I've got my phone running, and up in this top right hand corner next to the Wi-Fi icon, you'll see that the network activity monitor is going around and around in circles. And the reason it's doing that is because I turned it on and I haven't turned it off. So let's have a look at how we can manipulate that feature of the iPhone to show that there's some network activity going on, as well as we'll do some other exciting stuff. So basically we've created this class and we've set it up as a singleton because we only have one network activity indicator, so we don't want more occasions occurring. And then we have a call or a method function for when it starts, and we have another call for when it finishes. Now what I've done here is and typically what you do is you set up a loading count so that all of these network calls are happening asynchronously, and so you need to increment the number of times that network operations have started, and then when they finish, you need to decrement them by 1. So when it started, it went up from 1 and then 2, and then as the network operations finished, they went backwards 1 and 0. Now, what I've done, and I'll show you what the problem is, but let's have a look at our Firebase. Now, you may recall that in the last tutorial, I was telling you about this race condition, and the race condition was simply that we just put in a 3-second delay, and if all of our loading took more than 3 seconds, then it was possible for us to, I can't click on that because it's on my actual iPhone, but it was possible that this source list would be empty because we could click on it prior to receiving the information back from Firebase. So, and you can see the activity indicator is still going. And I said, well, it's a little bit of a pain because you've got to do all these things. So if we look at these Firebase calls, which are in the same file, so what we're doing is when we are loading a current user, we want to set the network activity indicator manager to started, and we'll worry about the closure in a minute. And then when we come back, we want to set the indicator to finished, and we need to do that in case there's an error, and we need to do that when we get data. Now for save, this is a synchronous call, or we really don't care. We're not worried about that. We just save it and it gets written away. But then we've got loading information. So again, we start this process, and we set the network activity indicator manager to started, and basically once it's started, it is going to send that little indicator spinning, and then again, once we get our data back, we finish, and if we get an error, then we also finish. And as I pointed out, there could be a whole heap of requests being done in here, and they're not going to, well, they're all asynchronous. They're not going to finish in the order, etc., etc., etc. So when we call the first one, that load count is going to become 1, and then it's going to become 2, and then as they finish, when this network operation finishes call, they're going to go down to 1 and then to 0. And when it gets to 0, that means that they've all finished, and so that's when we can call stop. So that's the functionality there. I did get rid of the thing. Now what I've done, that's how you would normally do it, but look, there's two cases when you're doing this kind of process, and the first process is when you get all that database, all that data information back, you want to do something on the user interface. And the second thing is you don't want to do something on the user interface, you're just doing something in background, like maybe writing stuff to a local database using core data, or user defaults, or whatever it might be. So in the case where, so the way to handle these two events is, in the case where you want to do something on the user interface, what I've done is I've said, okay, well, when we load the current user, this is only called at the beginning of the, when the app's loading. And so for a closure, we want to pass this move to main window. So you might recall that we had this line here, dispatch queue, after 3 seconds, move to main window. We had it down here last time, and that was what's calling our race condition. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking this move to main window function, and I'm passing it as a closure function. Okay, and what I can do is for every time I call this started, I can provide a separate closure function. And what is going on in our network activity is we've got this this array of functions. Now in my case, all they do is they're void functions, they have no parameters, and they're returning void. And we set it to be an empty array, and then every time we come through, when we start the application, we have this dot functions, and we append our closure. So we're basically setting up an array of functions that we want to call when our network operation is finished, and that's exactly what we do. When our load count is 0, when everything is finished, then we go onto the main queue, because we're only providing these calls for the user interface, and all user interface calls need to be run on the main queue. And then we just go through every function that we have. Now we may only have one, and we may have nil, but essentially for every function that we have, we put that function into the queue, and then we remove all of those functions. Now these functions are just placed into the one queue, and so they are processed consecutively as they come off the queue. So if we run this again, what we'll find is, okay, so as you can see now, our activity monitor is not running, and there was an activity monitor on our start screen, and then when the start screen finished, well, that was because this function was calling move to main screen. Now we've had to do some fudging, because we need to use this at escaping keyword for our functions, and the reason we need to put at escaping there is because we don't know when this function is going to be called. It's going to be called somewhere down the track. So at escaping breaks it away from the function that's called it. So if we go back to my Firebase, so move to main window is going to be at escaping, which means that we're going to call this .network operation started, and the operating system will just place a copy of this function and all of the data and parameters, etc., that it needs to run somewhere else in memory, and it just retains a reference to this value, and then when it's called later in our network activity, when it's called down here as our function, that's the reference and all the data it needs. The compiler knows exactly what to do, and it runs it. So the problem is that escaping can only be used on function types. It can't be used on optionals. It's a known bug in the system, and so what I've done is, so I can't pass, where is it? Let's go back here. So that's the first one, and then the second one here, you see I've got a function called do nothing, and guess what that does? Yes, it does nothing. So we've got this function do nothing, which does nothing, right? So normally, well, what we're doing is we're passing this function, which when it runs, it's going to queue and it's going to finish in a millisecond, and that's all it will do. But normally you would write something like nil, and then that would be an optional and everything would be happy, but that's going to cause a problem. Nil is not compatible, and if we try and make it compatible by going into Nectivity. Okay, so if we take all of that and make it optional, let's try running that. And there you go, expected declaration. Oh, what's nasty is going on there? So no, we need to put the comma. Just trying to get you the right error message. There you go. Nil is not compatible with the expected argument type. Is that it? Right, maybe I need to put it in here. There you go, that's the error we've got. Add escaping attribute were only used in a function parameter. And then it says, oh, you can remove it, well, that's not going to help us because, oops, that's not what we need. So essentially, those are the errors that you would get, and the fudge is to just have a function which just does nothing. So I'll just go back and fix that code. Closure, do nothing. Okay, that's all good. Now you may have seen there was also an activity monitor in the middle of the screen. So on our splash screen, what I've done here, now there's two times when our splash screen is displayed. The first time is when it's actually downloading information, and it's downloading information, and then it's going to display what you're seeing now. And the second time is if it's going to the login screen. And in the login screen case, you might recall we just show it for 3 seconds. But in both cases, it's being displayed, and all we want to do is we want to tell our clients through the use of an activity indicator that something's happening. And so basically I create a user interface item called a UIActityIndicator view, and I give it a frame. We add that subview, and I've also created some constraints for it to make it a little bit larger. It's 100 by 100. But what I want to do, because my activity indicator, the default is white, and my image has got white text, I want to change the color of it to black. So I need to create these view styles, dot white large, and then change the color to dot black. And then what I want to do is on view did appear, that is when that window, that's the splash screen, appears on the screen, we're going to start animating straight away. And then we've got on view will disappear, we're going to stop animating. So we don't want to use view did disappear, because once it's disappeared, we're going to be losing these indicators. So the correct place to do is view will disappear. That's the warning we get prior to it disappearing. We send the stop animating. So that's basically whenever that window, which is our splash screen, is displayed, it's going to start with that central indicator straight away, and it'll stop once the window closes. So that's sort of like a kludgy way of not having to do this Firebase trick where every time we call one of these Firebase procedures, we would need to display the indicator, and then when the function closure runs, we need to turn off that indicator. So it's just there for the entire screen. We don't need to worry about counting and things like that while we do, like we do here in our Network Activity Indicator Manager. So now the other thing I was going to say to you about the Network Activity Indicator Manager, we dealt with the case where we're using these functions to return values, but if we're going to do something on the return of the Firebase call in this closure, like we don't want to just say, oh, well, the network operation is finished. If we just want to do something in the background, where we can just do it in the closure and it'll be processed and it's not going to affect anything else. But if it's anything that's to do with the user interface, then we want to pass it as one of these closures so that the network activity function is going to ensure that it's on the main queue, and then it's going to go through every function we have and basically run that function. Now, the only other thing that I need to show you this time is over in our settings, we now have the subscribe button, and if you click on subscribe, it just takes you to the Patreon website, and clients, if you want to subscribe to the channel, you can look at the channel and become a patron just by clicking on it. We've got rewards, so our novice reward is simply you get access. You won't get the annoying ads that are in the tutorial, and you will. Well, I shouldn't say the tutorial. Well, you won't get the annoying ads in the tutorial or in the app once it's released, and you'll also be able to access our first live stream of the month, Sunday Swift, and you contribute $1 or more a month. Then we have programmers, which is going to be $20 or more a month, and programmers are committed Swift developers who want access to a broad range of source code and tutorials at their fingertips. Programmers become organizational members on GitHub and have access to our live streaming events, including our weekly Q&A, Sunday Swift. And finally, we have team members. So if you want to get some work experience, you can join one of our Swift Almanac projects as a developer and team member, and help us get our efforts into the App Store, gaining valuable work experience and references for future employment. And that's $55 a month. And that's because, one, it's going to take up some of my time, and two, we also need to cover the costs of our Jira/Atlassian workspace. So that's basically how it'll work, and people need to log in, etc., 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 and then go back to the app once they have subscribed. Now, the other thing I was going to show you on our channel app, now you might recall before the channel app was just a hyperlink. So we had this hyperlink class that we created, and we put a URL in here, and basically there's a tap gesture, and when people tap on the link, it calls the URL, it tries to see if it's reachable, and then it calls shared open and opens that URL. Now, the thing is that if it's a YouTube link, it won't open YouTube. It will open a browser, and then the browser will go to YouTube and that kind of stuff. It's not great. So I've created another one called YouTube. So YouTube link works exactly the same, except we're passing a YouTube ID rather than the complete URL. Again, it's got a tap gesturizer. It works exactly the same way, and as you can see, it doesn't look any different. But essentially what it does is it says down here, when you click on it, set up this variable URL, and it's a string which starts off YouTube : / and then the YouTube ID. And if we can open that URL, then, oh, well, if we can't, because there's a bang there in front of the name. But if we can't open that URL, then we do this URL. We change the variable to the HTTP equivalent, and put the YouTube v equals and the YouTube ID in, and then depending on which one of these two events occurs, either the initial or the second one, we just call UI application shared open URL. Now the reason why I've got my phone up here rather than the simulator is because the simulator doesn't have YouTube built into it, so it will always show the other case. But my phone, if I click on it, will open YouTube and display a YouTube message. So there you go. Now there's one other thing that I need to show you in order to get this YouTube-y thing working. Under the information plist, at the very bottom here, we've placed these 4 lines here, the LS application queries schemes, and we've added YouTube there. And what we need to do is, if we don't put this application query scheme into the info plist, we don't get permission to call can open URL. So if you don't remember to put that in, then you won't. This is always going to fail. Our YouTube is always going to fail, and it's always going to open in UI. In UI application shared open, which is going to open a browser. Okay. Well, we're looking pretty good here now. People can now subscribe to the channel, and I get emails when this occurs. I'm going to tidy up the rest of the interface and finalize the Firebase and GitHub API calls, and then the only 2 things that are remaining are notifications and loading up on the App Store. Don't forget to click like, and in any event, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any of our awesome tutorials. Look forward to seeing you soon. Cheers.